as far as influencing Iran, there's no evidence that anything we're doing is influencing Iran at this point. We are defeated, and nothing he does at this point is going to make any difference. And the Iranians have made that very clear. That's why they've said they have no intention of negotiating with this administration. They'll wait until he leaves office, presumably in 2029. I think he might go earlier. But having said that, they know that we are not governed per se by Donald Trump or the voice of the American people. These institutions and the people in them have all been purchased by the Zionist Jewish billionaires who are actually in control. And there's no point in talking to them. You might as well try to talk to Netanyahu. And I think they know that's a waste of time.
Let's take a look at some of the economic stuff here, because there is a school of thought that there are those here, and we're going to see some of those voices later in this show, that are saying, hey, there's economic pain on Iran, and there's some on us too, but it's going to hit them harder. But there is one factor. You mentioned the fertilizer. There's another factor that's right now with jet fuel is actually getting closer to being a critical issue. There have been some analysts I saw just yesterday that said there's maybe 3 or 4 weeks left that can handle the current economic activity at the current status. And then they're going to have to start curtailing and cutting out, either dramatically raising the price of airline traffic, and that's everything, not just passengers, but also transport, et cetera. Or they're going to have to start cutting routes because they just physically don't have enough jet fuel at any price. And you see U.S. carriers are also taking a financial hit. That's something that will probably hit before the end of the month. And without the strait being fully open, and that means both sides, that's going to be a problem. How are we going to mitigate that?
Well, I don't think we can, frankly, unless we wise up and essentially disengage from the war. One of the things I wrote recently was the importance now for the United States, as well as for virtually all the nations of the world, to start building towards resource sovereignty. What we're saying is access to food, fuel, feed, fertilizer, precious metals and minerals can't depend on distant choke points anymore. The days when the United States Navy secured global seaways are over. I mean, that's the principal defeat. He says the United States Navy is doing a brilliant job controlling the strait. Well, it's parked outside of the strait, far enough away that if it's taken under attack, it has a chance to avoid being struck. What is the U.S. Navy actually doing other than harming the global economy and our own? It certainly isn't helping us in terms of our national security. So I think ultimately what happens in the Gulf is that the non-Western world, Iran and other countries in the region, as well as around the world, will resolve the situation in the Gulf, not us.
And you talk about resource sovereignty here. One of the things about Iran is that they are largely self-contained, is that they have the natural resources they have access here through the northern sea route here. They have lots of farmland, et cetera, where they can grow most of their own food. They have water. They obviously have petroleum resources. So even if you blockade everything, even if somehow you cut all these land routes, which we can't, not even close to having resources to even attempt that, much less succeed, you're not going to strangle them out, because they do have a version of resource in sovereignty that others don't have. And that leads to them being able to make statements or demands, I think, like these that they're doing right now, which is basically, we're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz until you correct your behavior, which they define as you must never threaten Iran again, permanently end the war, and with its allies in the region, lift the naval blockade, withdraw forces from the region, completely compensate Iran, and release our foreign assets, which is everything from the memorandum of understanding, but all up front. Instead of before, there was, I think, only 3 main things that we had to do: drop the blockade, release sanctions, and then provide frozen funds, which we didn't do. But everything else was supposed to be negotiated. Now they're saying all the things to negotiate have to be up front, or they're not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. And the question is, with that resource sovereignty to whatever degree, is that enough for them to maintain that even with the blockade longer than we can?
Well, remember that Iran is a continental power, which means that it has support and sustainment coming into it from Russia as well as China. We're a maritime power. Whatever we do has to go 6,000 miles, largely by ship and secondarily by air. And the bases that we're operating from are no longer bases in close proximity to Iran, which means that we've got that much further to go than we normally would, whether it's to launch strikes or to conduct surveillance or anything else. I think there are a couple of other things that we should mention. You know, there's a book called by Norman Davies, and it's a book about World War II, and it's really worth reading. And it compares what happened during the war between Germany, Russia, or the Soviet Union and ourselves. And when you look at that and you fast forward into the current environment, you understand something. Iran can withstand a lot more damage. Their standard of living is not nearly as high as ours. If it suffers, it's not going to be as acutely felt in Iran as it is going to be felt here in the United States. The other thing is that Iran is in an existential war, much like the Soviet Union and Germany were. We're not in an existential conflict. We haven't even declared war, which is not a minor consideration. Then you've got to add something else. The Houthis inside Al-Ansarah have now attacked Saudi Arabia's shipping in the Red Sea. The Saudis aren't moving anything out of Yanbu. They can turn around and destroy Yanbu if they decide to do it. And they can also reach oil infrastructure as well from southern Yemen. So I guess my point is, from a purely strategic calculus standpoint, the Iranians, in Donald Trump's words, hold all the cards, Dan. We don't hold any at this point. And in the meantime, the rest of the world, especially in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, is rearranging itself in real time. You now have this new alliance between Saudi Arabia. I don't want to say alliance, but it's clearly a security alignment between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. My understanding is that the Egyptians are now under a lot of pressure to join it. And I think there's a lot of evidence that they may well do that. So that means the largest, most powerful Sunni Muslim Arab states, plus the Turks, plus Pakistan, will be aligned against Israel. I mean, absolutely, unquestioningly aligned against Israel, and secondarily against us. And it's not a direct attack on us, but it's a recognition that we've demonstrated we can't protect anybody in the Gulf. And as a result, they're going to form an alliance that's designed to protect them on their own without help from us. So I think this new Turkey, Saudi, Paki, potentially Egypt defense pact is crafted to halt Greater Israel and replace us in the Gulf.
And, you know, one of those constraints, you talked about resource sovereignty. We don't seem to even have that because our resources in the military realm are running low. There was an interesting exchange on Fox News yesterday, not in the direction you might think, although some of those are coming, with Dan Hoffman, former CIA station chief that's on a lot of national security issues. And in this exchange here, he's going to use a lot of the buzzwords about how bad Iran is and they're terrible and all this stuff. But listen pretty carefully, because he's going to admit something here, that there is a major shortfall in our military resource in the absence of sovereignty because of our defense industrial base from 10 years ago. Now, he also went on to talk about the debt that we have, and I'll talk about that separately because that affects it. But he's admitting here now that, and this is something you've always said, even on our show and in your books, that you want to, the army, the military that you want to go to war with, you had better been starting it 10 years before, because that's how long it takes to bring these things into account. He's talking about just the defense industrial base is 3 years or more away from even having an effect on what's going on now. But Doug, we just talked about, we've got 3 or 4 weeks to make some kind of a decision here, or we're going to be in a world of financial hurt.
Well, Hoffman and Feinberg are both Israeli firsters. So they're going to find an excuse to do whatever is possible to pour more money into this war against Iran. And for that matter, into any conflict that is either anti-Russian, anti-Iranian, and for the most part, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, let's put it that way, in the region. We have no interest in that as a country. There's no reason why we should be engaged in any of those things. So let's get that straight. Secondly, yes, he's telling us now things that we said a very long time ago. I don't know how many times I've written it, and I wrote it because I was being told these things by friends in the industry, friends in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, GD. We have no surge capacity, none. That's something that we lost a long time ago, and no one cared. And the biggest problem we have is that the whole force posture is designed for the short war. It's designed to essentially beat down weak opponents that have little to no air and missile defense, and certainly no significant naval or Air Force capability. Those days are over. And what Iran marks is a fundamental sea change in the history of international relations. Iran is a former great power in the form of Persia. It now has the human capital as well as the scientific industrial knowledge to build enormous quantities of missiles, long, medium range, strike, tactical ballistic missiles, unmanned systems, whatever it is, within the framework of this new technology for space-based surveillance. It gives you persistent surveillance and instant targeting data. This is a revolution for which we were completely unprepared. We should have been, because you and others and I have talked about what was done under Surovikin when he established the strategic defense at the end of 2022 that had inflicted such terrible damage on the Ukrainians and made it impossible for the Ukrainians to mass any significant numbers of forces. And whenever they did, they lost them. We paid no attention to that. And we assumed from the outset that Iran was not what it is. Iran was a weak power. Iran was incapable of withstanding the might of the United States military. You know, all this sort of self-congratulatory, narcissistic crap. All of that has fallen short. We should be disengaging. We should be returning home, focused on what's important here, and studying carefully what we need to do for the future. Because right now, we're not really postured in a different way. We haven't fundamentally rethought the structure. We haven't raised any of the critical questions. You know, where do we fight? How do we fight? How do we get there? With whom? And so forth. All of those things had to be answered differently now and from now on. Feinberg's not going to do that. Hoffman certainly won't. Nobody in the administration will. They're all focused on one thing. And this is the problem when everybody says, well, why doesn't Donald Trump simply recognize the futility of continuing and end it? Well, how does he explain that to the people that put him in office? How does he explain that to the people that control the House, the Senate, and the White House?
Well, he could explain to them by saying physical constraints prohibit us from doing that without basically committing national suicide. We'll see how that's going to work out. But sticking with this part about here, okay, there's no surge capacity that exists. They've tried to, and it's just incrementally moved out a little bit. But even Hoffman later in that same interview said, listen, even that's something in the next 2 to 3 years is going to be hard enough because we already have nearly $40 trillion debt hanging over us, and you just can't keep adding to that without eventually that collapsing on top of us. Or do you think he's wrong? Can we literally just forever keep adding to the national debt?
No, we can't. But what people will ask you, and this is where Nassim Taleb, he talks about the black swan, you know, these events. And what he'll tell you is that we have a swimming pool full of black swans right now. We don't know when they're all going to take off, but they're all primed and ready to fly, which means that you could have a number of different kinds of bubbles and collapses in the financial system, the banking system, the treasury markets. We've seen the beginning of this in Japan. We're watching this slow global fracturing and meltdown in the Western financial system. So everybody will say, well, when's it really going to break? When's it really going to hit? And everybody will tell you the same thing. Nobody really knows. But I think most of us, and you know, I'm talking about people that I trust, whether it's someone like Ray Dalio or Luke Roman or Jeffrey Gundlach, Alistair McLeod. I mean, we go down the list. All of these people are very bright, thoughtful analysts, and they say it's coming, and it's coming soon. I would think that President Trump is increasingly aware of that. If he wasn't, he would never have said what he did in Paris. I'm not going to end up like Herbert Hoover. I know the global economy could go into a depression. That's why we must open the strait. Well, obviously, he gets it. He understands. So we're back to the critical question, Dan. Why isn't he responding appropriately? Why is he essentially dragging us into a protracted war? Because people like Hoffman and Feinberg and others in the White House and on the Hill, they want a protracted conflict. They don't understand the consequences for us as a country, let alone the rest of the world. They're only thinking about their interests and Israel's. And their interests and Israel's demand a protracted war. But we can't do it. That's the bottom line. I wonder how long it's going to take before President Trump figures that out, because you and I know there's a lot of evidence for a lot of unhappy people in the armed forces right now who've had to live under miserable conditions at sea for months and months and months. You get at some point revolts, rebellions. And I don't know if we'll get it, but it's not impossible. I mean, nobody that's been to sea for any length of time can appreciate how bad it is right now in the Indian.
Well, one has to ask the question, though. A lot of these people who say they want these open-ended conflict and they whatever for Israel's interest or whatever it is, they still are not stupid people. They may be greedy, but they're not stupid, and they should be able to see this. I mean, with Dan Hoffman's even admitting some of this stuff, because that was one of the more tame ones that he said in the last few months here, but that is not tame from coming from somebody like, well, Mike Pompeo. So he's still obviously saying that going back to war. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Do you think he actually does believe that, yeah, we just need to go back to military and that will force the Iran open?
He believes what his donors tell him, and he will do what his donors want him to do. He's in a position very similar to President Trump. He's on the payroll. He's part of the group. This man is not going to back away from any action, regardless of how stupid it is, let alone stand up and make it clear that we as Americans have no strategic interest in this war. We're not interested in going to war with virtually everybody in the region. We're not interested in killing Muslims everywhere. We're not interested in killing anybody anywhere at this point. There's no reason why we should be. I mean, these are the kinds of people that have been telling us for years, nuclear warheads are on their way in Iran. Soon they'll be on missiles. And then New York City and Los Angeles are at risk. It takes me back to the 1960s. Why didn't Lyndon Baines Johnson nuke China when we identified that they had nuclear facilities? What made China different from everyone else so that he wasn't necessarily concerned about that? And why did Richard Nixon refuse to join Brezhnev in a joint Soviet-American strike against Chinese nuclear development? I mean, why not? Because it's insane. You don't precipitate wars over nuclear weapons and with nuclear weapons. You don't do it. If you do, it will lead to a larger conflagration. Now, the one thing we can say with absolute certainty is that all of the demands that Pompeo and the rest of these people have made on behalf of their mentors and sponsors and donors in the Israel lobby, if you want to call it that, they have said repeatedly all sorts of things, all of which were lies, all of which were wrong and made no sense. They're not going to back off from it right now. But none of it makes sense for us. It never did. And we don't need to be part of this. I think that's why the polls reflect what they do. I was talking to a friend the other day who's Jewish, and he said, don't you think these polls that suggest that more than 70% of the American people oppose the war indicate that anti-Semitism is on the rise? I said, well, I wouldn't be surprised if anti-Semitism isn't on the rise for a whole range of reasons right now connected with this government and our foreign and domestic policy. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the real issue is that Americans see no reason for this. They don't buy it. And when this hits them financially and economically over the next several months, it's going to be hell to pay in Washington. It'll be really very interesting to see how people jump off this sinking Titanic that President Trump sadly has made himself captain of, because that's what he's on. That's why I said he's writing the book, The Art of Defeat. It's tragic. It's unnecessary. I think he knows.